I'm happy to be here today and talking about some of the work we've been doing at Creative Commons around OER search and discovery. And just a little background, I've been at Creative Commons a little over 6 years now, and I'm currently the Chief Technology Officer, and so a lot of my job is thinking about how technology and standards that are adjacent to Creative Commons licenses impact what we do, and also how we can apply what we've learned around licenses and linked data to other domains. And so that's kind of how this project came about. Sort of the first question is, what happens after you publish your OER? And by that, I mean we have this idea that we're creating a lot of OER, but there's not always the question about what happens afterward. And I think there's been this implicit feedback loop that we assume happens, which is, you create something, you make it available, others are going to find your work, and they're going to reuse it or remix it, they're going to translate it, and they're going to republish their improved version, so that the next person down the line has an even better version to work with, and has an even a more complete or a different perspective, and that they're continually growing this pool of available resources. And sort of my hypothesis today, or my supposition, is that this all depends upon being able to actually find the OER that you are that in the first place. So in order to, before you can reuse or remix or adapt a work, you need to be able to find it. And I would like to simply say that web scale search is failing for OER. And I'm basing this on a few different conversations, and I would like to freely admit that none of these are very scientific. So I actually, when I was writing the paper for this, I actually did go and look for actual literature on the subject, and there's not a lot of it. And so basically this is based on conversations that we've been having for the past 2 years, I guess, 2.5 years, where educators and creators and people who are looking to, people who want to just learn something come and ask us, well, I want to find CC licensed materials. I also want to find, but specifically I want educational materials. So the one common thing is, there's this, you look for cell organelles on Google, and there's about 1.2 million results, and so hopefully what you want comes up very quickly. I made these slides before Yahoo started serving Bing results, so I guess I should recreate them. But I think Yahoo, it looks like, had about 5 million results for cell organelles, so that's not necessarily all that helpful. So just as a bit of, so this is where applying our past experience comes into play, because in 2002 there was this question about how do you find CC licensed works. Creative Commons doesn't, when you go to our website and choose a license, we don't retain any of that information. We don't keep a database of licensed works. We don't ask you to upload them to a repository. And so when Creative Commons started out, we had a linked data model for how licenses worked. But there's this open question, how do you find a CC licensed work? And what we ended up doing was we built a search engine to demonstrate how this would work. And actually, you probably can't see it in the screenshot here, but when I made these slides the first time, I had to go to the Wayback Machine on the Internet Archive to get this screenshot, because we've since been able to shut this down. And that actually was a definition of success for us in this particular project. When we started talking to search engines, Google and Yahoo, or I guess actually the opposite order, Yahoo and Google, about how to do this, the conversations usually went something along the lines of, that's really interesting, and you guys are doing great work. We just think you're fabulous, but and we'll think about it. And when we actually had built something to demonstrate how this might work, we were able to actually go with actual data and actual experience to talk about what the challenges and pros and cons were. So and when they rolled out their implementation, they were obviously able to scale this a lot faster and larger than we could, so we were able to shut this particular service down. I think it's useful to think about, or it's helpful to think about what this, as a useful search, what it provides. And the results are relevant. In this case, that means they were CC licensed. They're usable, so you could filter by a specific license type if you knew you wanted something that would allow you to remix it, make a derivative work, for example. And there were results from a variety of sources. So it wasn't just the Internet Archive, which was allowing uploads. It wasn't just Flickr. We were doing a series of crawls so that we could discover new content and increase the size of our index. So these are sort of the criteria I think about when I think about OER searches, that, how do we find stuff that's relevant, that's an educational material, that's usable, so either based on the license or the format that, for the actual software and tools I have available, and how do I find it from, how do I go someplace and find material from many sources at the same time? So, there's this question, how do you find OER? And OER search in a lot of ways is the next increment of CC search, because there's these really market similarities. There's no centralized repository or list of what is OER. It's up to publishers or creators to label their works, just like with CC licenses. But there's also these additional facets that make it an interesting technical problem to look at, like what is an educational material? Are we talking about K-12? Are we talking about secondary? Are we talking about vocational learning? These all, you can imagine these might be, you might want to return different results in these different scenarios. So, how do we calculate relevance? And there's also these additional facets that you might want. These apply to CC licensed works as well, but we never really delved into these previously. So what language is it in? And what format is it in? That sort of thing. What we built was a prototype called Discover Ed. And Discover Ed it really is an experiment that we've been building to try and test some of these ideas and get some experience with how this might work. So you can see this is an example. It looks a little different these days, but this is an example search for cell organelles again. And I guess there are about 400 results, and I don't know that those are the best 400 results or that they're a complete list of the educational resources. I'm sure they're not the complete list of educational resources on cell organelles, but they are but it's a much more tractable list, and these are things that people have specifically said are educational. So the model we used was one of curators, and this is really the key to how we started looking at how to address the relevance question and the question of what is educational. So the idea being that curators can serve as a proxy for particular positions and points of view. So the curators can identify resources. Maybe they're resources that they're creating. Maybe there are third-party resources. They may add metadata to them in addition. And then we ingest those resource lists. We're using feeds and then OAI PMH as our primary transports right now. So an example of this would be a resource at Connections on elementary algebra. And Connections publishes actually some linked data. They publish information about the title, what type of resource it is, and who created it. They publish tags and subject keywords, and they also publish license information about that particular resource. So this is all metadata that they're publishing about the things in their repository. OER Commons also ingests this same resource, and you can see that, well, you may not be able to see. This is the same resource, and it has the title information that came from Connections, but then it also adds information about the language, tags that have been provided by their particular community, and I guess file format information as well. So so this is an example of two different curators adding or providing information about the exact same resource, and ideally you'd want to provide all of this to a user for searching. So we end up with this situation where we have feeds coming from, I guess I don't have a mouse, but you can see on the left-hand side, there's an example of what might be a feed that just has simple pointers to resources. In the middle one, this is like an idea that there's a feed that has some additional metadata about the title, license, where it came from, language, that sort of thing. And finally, you could also make assertions like it conforms to a particular specification or a particular quality metric. And this gives us a sort of an architecture that looks like this, where we aggregate curated resources and we put them into an RDF store. So we store where we found them, where they came from, and we use that information to drive a Nutch crawl. So Nutch is an open source Apache project. It's a search engine based on Lucene, and basically by using that we're able to avoid rebuilding the sort of the common bits. So so how is this different from other things? One thing that's a little bit different is we're indexing both the text and the metadata, and there are other solutions that do this, but this enables us to be a little more forgiving when a resource doesn't have the exact same set of metadata. So you can still get some search utility out of the resource. Ingesting this metadata lets us do faceted search, and so you can drill down. If you start with a particular set of search results and you're looking at the first page and you decide, this particular curator does not actually, their resources don't seem to be particularly interesting to me, you could exclude them from your search and revise it that way. And finally, and I think really importantly, it lets you search across resources that aren't all in a single repository. So it's not, the things we would like publishers to do in terms of linked data are not Discover Ed specific. I think they improve linked data on the web generally, and by not having a single repository we're asking everybody to dump into our bucket, it makes it a lot more scalable, a lot more web-like, and eliminates the single point of sort of contention and failure. So that's a little bit of overview of what we've done of the project. So a little bit of information about what we've done recently and what we're working on now with respect to this. So recently, we've added basic support for provenance to our model and the query interface. And basically, this lets us do a lot more much richer queries based on who provided the metadata and the resource. So users theoretically could do a lot more fine-grained query about, I find that these particular curators or these particular subject tags are things that are relevant to my particular searching, and do that. We've added support for MediaWiki as a curation tool, and this would be an example where a community publishing resources and doing quality review could act as a de facto curator. And we had a sprint hosted by Michigan State this summer where we added support for plugins that could add additional metadata. And the idea here is you may want to do things like semantic analysis when you're missing metadata, so that you can kind of augment things that way. One way we're using it right now is to look up terms that come in as subject tags in a multilingual thesaurus and add those to the index as well, to help across the language barrier. You can normalize things so those are applications that are supported by this new plugin work. The things we want to do, I think the idea is that Discover Ed isn't, we're not a search engine company, and we're not going to be. But I think it's a useful tool in demonstrating how resources can be consumed. And so to that end, we want to connect with curators and users. And with respect to curators, and by curators, a lot of times I mean publishers in this particular context, our goal is we think it's good for people to publish linked data, and it's useful for the web in general. But there's a perception that we need a feedback loop to help drive this. So so our experience in this case that's relevant, I think, is that people started marking attribution information for their CC licensed works when we started showing that information on the license deed when you clicked through, or they started doing it a lot more. And that's because now they had an incentive to do it. They had a reason that it was useful to them. And so providing some kind of feedback loop I think is going to be really helpful to help people publish linked data. So we're working on a dashboard sort of view that would let people who are contributing their work to something like DiscoverEd see what's being indexed and what's actually being found. And so they can actually just see, am I actually getting indexed the way I think I should be? I think I've marked this up as linked data. Is it really being discovered that way? And help drill down on those things. Connecting with, and the other end of that is connecting with users. So the question is, how do we ask for feedback, and how do we actually study things and get real data out of this, as opposed to sort of anecdotal evidence, which I'm not saying it's inaccurate. I just would like to have real. I'd like to be able to actually point to something that is more deterministic. So, there's this question about how everything connects together, and we've got some experiments we're going to be running here in the next few months that I hope will at least tell us whether these approaches are going to be helpful. I don't think we'll have data in the next few months, but I'd like to be able to say whether those are actually helpful. And there are actually a couple open questions as well that are actually really important. One of them is, how do we measure efficacy? So right now, we have a lot of anecdotal evidence that web scale search is not working, and that there's some sort of, quote unquote, obvious evidence of that in terms of the number of results and being overwhelming, that sort of thing. But is there actually a way we can measure recall, that sort of thing, recall and relevance? And how do you discover curators? Right now we ask people to give us their feeds or tell us when they want to be ingested, but for this to truly scale, there has to be a way to denote this on the web and be able to discover these. And so that's quite a thorny question still. So there's information in our wiki about DiscoverEd. All of our code is up on Gitorious, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Nathan. Obviously, we share a lot of concerns, and we have some different approaches to, I think, basically work on the same problem. Maybe I should also mention that also in Globe, we expose our data now as linked open data. And I just wanted to ask you to elaborate a little bit on one of the differences in how we approach this problem. You mentioned that, well, we don't do repositories. We try to get stuff off the web, so to speak.
Right.
But it strikes me that I think what you call publishers or curators basically fulfill the same function to a large extent, I think, as what, in our case, repository providers do. And so just wanted you to elaborate a little bit on that, whether you also see it that way or...
Sure. So I would not want to imply that I don't see any utility in repositories. I absolutely do see their role and the utility and usefulness that they bring. I have observed that there have been some projects that the approach is put it all into a single repository, and so that's kind of what we're trying to do, is figure out how do we, I think repositories publishing linked open data is exactly the right thing to do, because you can enforce any sort of institutional or repository standards that are relevant for your particular community of interest, and also make it available to the wider web. So I think we're in violent agreement about that. I'm sorry if I was unclear or unnecessarily slagged on repositories.
Hi, Simon Buckingham at the Open University. We're really interested in trying to gather another kind of metadata around OERs, which is namely people's stories and experiences with them. And so we kind of have a similar problem, and we're trying to figure out how we would... I think you're solving a bit of the jigsaw that we didn't quite know how to do, which is tracking them down in the first place. And now we're trying to figure out how we can elicit experiences and stories about how it actually went when you actually tried using this thing.
Right.
So we should probably talk.
That'd be great. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we're hoping to... So one of the possible approaches is that we've looked at is engaging users at the time of search and trying to understand what was an effective search and what was a failed search. So what was a very positive experience or a very negative experience, and focusing on those particular. How do we get, what other common characteristics of these or of the very positive ones? And so one idea has been when there are very, very few results that come back or below a particular threshold, how can you elicit feedback about what were you actually, like what did you hope to find here, and try and connect that up with creators. And I should mention that work is being supported as part of the AgShare project with Michigan State University and the Gates Foundation. So.
Any other question? I got one.
Sure.
You said that you were interested in involving users, that one can discover another in the sense that they can share with curators, etc.
Right.
Have you considered using Delicious as a source for knowing how people is reusing these resources and how they are tagging them, etc.?
Right. We have. We've looked at Delicious in a couple of different contexts and how it might tie in. So you can imagine Delicious, somebody's Delicious account or Delicious tag as sort of being another way of curating resources. And there's actually a project the state of Maine in the United States is doing where a bunch of science teachers have gotten together and have started tagging resources they find that are useful for teaching science in their primary education settings. And so, the idea is being, can we take that information and use it to build a search portal very easily on top of that? We haven't looked at how, and we've also looked at using it to pull out popular tags for a resource that you might use to augment the metadata that comes from the publisher in terms of what other people think are the subjects. We haven't looked at it in terms of reuse or popularity in that respect, but that would be a really interesting question to ask. Thanks.